When my sister slammed the door in my face 9 years ago, she spat the word trash like it was poison. I had shown up at her wedding in my worn-out uniform, not yet an officer, not yet someone worth introducing. She told me I embarrassed her in front of her new wealthy in-laws. That night I walked away, my chest hollow, my pride broken, and I swore I'd never look back. For 9 years, I lived with the echo of her words. 9 years of silence. 9 years of building myself from nothing but grit and scars. She never called, never wrote, never cared if I was alive or dead. But life has a way of turning tables. I went through hell, training, battles, losses, and victories. Every insult I remembered became fuel. Every rejection, every sleepless night pushed me harder. Until one day, I wasn't the trash she had discarded. I was Colonel, standing at the helm of an oceanfront base, commanding hundreds of soldiers who looked at me with respect and loyalty she could never understand. Then she showed up, dressed in silk, rings sparkling on her fingers, the same cold face from years ago. But now it carried something else. Fear. Desperation. She wasn't here to gloat. She wasn't here to belittle me. She needed me. And in that moment, staring at the sister who had cut me out of her perfect life, I realized the past had come crashing back to demand a choice. Would I turn her away, the way she had done to me? Or would I show her that the brother she had once called trash now had the power to decide her fate? The night of my sister's wedding is burned into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a moment where family gathered under soft lights and music to witness the start of a new life. But for me, it became the night everything shattered, the night I was branded as trash and cast out of the only family I had left. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I can still smell the expensive roses that lined the aisle, hear the laughter of wealthy guests swirling around me, and feel the cold weight of humiliation pressing into my chest. I wasn't dressed like the others. While the men wore suits that looked custom-tailored and the women sparkled in gowns worth more than my yearly pay, I arrived in my standard military service uniform. It wasn't the polished dress uniform, not the kind officers wore when they gave speeches or saluted generals. No, mine was plain. Scuffed boots, faded stitching, the kind of uniform you wore after weeks of training and long nights on cots. It was all I had. My paycheck barely stretched far enough for rent and meals, let alone something worthy of my sister's high society wedding. But I wore it with quiet pride. For me, that uniform meant discipline, sacrifice, and a promise of a better future. I thought she would see that. I thought she would be proud. The ceremony itself was flawless. Strings of golden lights glimmered above as chandeliers threw shimmering patterns across the dance floor. Her husband's family was wealthy in a way I had never touched. The reception was held in a grand ballroom overlooking the sea, a place so polished it made me feel like an intruder. Guests toasted with champagne I couldn't pronounce, laughed with the careless ease of people who had never worried about the price of bread. I stayed on the edge of the crowd, clapping when others clapped, smiling when the cameras flashed, keeping my head down. I told myself I didn't belong here. But at least I belonged to her. At least I was her brother. That illusion broke when she found me. I had stepped outside onto the terrace, trying to catch a breath of salt air and shake off the sting of feeling invisible. She appeared in her gown, the lace trailing behind her like a queen's robe. Her face framed with diamonds that caught every flicker of light. For a moment I wanted to hug her, to tell her she was beautiful, that despite the distance between us these last few years, I was proud of her. But her eyes froze me before I could speak. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Just needed some air," I said quietly. "Big night. Congratulations, by the way." She didn't smile. Her gaze slid over me, from the worn boots to the creases in my uniform, and her lips curled as though she had swallowed something bitter. "You came here like this," she whispered harshly, her voice shaking not from emotion but from fury. I looked down at myself, then back at her. "It's my uniform. It's all I have. I thought." "You thought wrong," she cut in, stepping closer, her perfume suffocating in its sweetness. "Do you have any idea how you look right now? How embarrassing this is for me?" My husband's family is here. His colleagues, his business partners, people who matter. And you show up looking like, she stopped herself, but the word hung in the air anyway. Like what? Asked my voice low. Like trash. The word landed harder than any punch I had ever taken. Trash. She didn't just mean my clothes or my lack of wealth. She meant me, my life, my choices, everything I stood for. I felt the blood rush to my face, the shame burning hotter than the summer night around us. I came here for you, I said finally, the words rough in my throat. You're my sister. No, she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. Or was it fear that someone would overhear? Not tonight. Not like this. You don't belong here. You never will. You are a reminder of everything I had to climb out of, everything I refused to be associated with. You're not family anymore. You're nothing. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at her. My sister, the girl I had shared a tiny room with growing up, the one I used to protect from bullies, the one I thought would always stand beside me. Now she looked at me like I was dirt on her shoes. Guests laughed inside, music swelled, glasses clinked. But on that terrace, the world went silent. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her if she remembered the nights we had gone hungry together. The nights I had stayed up to make sure she had the last blanket when the power was cut. I wanted to remind her of who we were, where we came from, and how far we both had traveled. But I saw the steel in her eyes, the certainty that she meant every cruel word, and I knew nothing I said would matter. So I turned. I walked away without another word, down the steps, past the valet who barely glanced at me, and into the night. I walked until the music faded into the ocean wind, until the lights of her perfect ballroom became distant specks, until the weight in my chest was too heavy to carry. I found myself alone on the shore, the waves crashing against the rocks, the salt stinging my eyes. Not just from the sea, but from the tears I refused to let fall. That was the last time I saw her for 9 years. She never called, never wrote. And I never reached out either. Her words carved a wall between us that I was too wounded to climb. From that night forward, I told myself I was truly alone. But in that loneliness, something else was born. Spark. Fire. If she saw me as nothing but trash, then I would build myself into something she could never ignore. I would rise so high that her words would turn to ash in her mouth. I didn't know how or when, but I swore under that moonlit sky, with the ocean as my witness, that one day I would no longer be the brother she threw away. I would become someone greater, someone untouchable. And though I didn't know it then, that vow was the first step on the long, brutal road that would lead me to command an oceanfront base, to wear the rank of colonel, and to face her again. Not as the brother she called trash, but as the man who had the power to decide her fate. The first years in the military broke most men. For me, they reshaped me. When I walked into basic training, still raw from the sting of my sister's rejection, I carried her words with me like a stone in my chest. Trash. That's what she had called me, and I could hear it every time I lay on the cold barracks floor, every time I stood at attention until my knees trembled, every time a drill sergeant's voice ripped through the air. Where others cursed the pain and wished to quit, I clung to it. I welcomed the blisters, the bruises, the sleepless nights. Because every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, every punishment screamed back at her. I am not trash. Training was merciless. The mornings began before dawn, with a bugle that tore us from shallow sleep. We were thrust into push-ups, sit-ups, and endless miles of running under the rising sun, our bodies screaming before breakfast. The drill sergeants prowled like wolves, their voices sharp as knives, calling us weak, pathetic, useless. Some recruits broke down. I remember one night, a boy no older than 18 packed his duffel in silence and vanished before morning roll call. I understood why. But me, I had no place to run back to. The world behind me was closed, sealed by the slam of my sister's door. This was all I had left. What I lacked in size, I made up for in willpower. My body ached constantly, but I refused to fall behind. During ruck marches, when our packs felt like anvils and the straps dug bloody lines into our shoulders, I pressed forward. Men cursed, stumbled, some collapsed by the roadside, medics rushing to drag them away. I locked my teeth and forced one foot in front of the other, step after step, until my vision blurred. I knew if I collapsed, if I quit, I would prove her right. And I would not let that happen. There was one night I'll never forget. The rain had been falling for hours, soaking us to the bone, turning the training field into a swamp of mud. We had been ordered to crawl through it, rifles in hand, our faces scraping the dirt. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked, and the sergeant's voice howled above the storm. "Move, you worthless maggots!" My arms burned, my knees shredded against the stones beneath the sludge, and the mud filled my mouth until I gagged. Men around me shouted in pain, some sobbing, some cursing God himself. And in that misery, I felt something strange. Not despair, not hopelessness, but power. Because I could feel her voice in my head, calling me trash, and with every crawl forward, I was spitting it back in her face. I dragged myself through that storm until the whistle finally blew, and when I staggered to my feet, covered head to toe in filth, I realized something. I was harder than I had ever been before. That mindset carried me beyond basic training. When others fell, I kept going. When we were tested on marksmanship, I stayed late on the range, learning the weight and recoil of every weapon until my aim was steady as stone. When we were drilled on tactics, I studied every manual, memorized maps, practiced until I could run operations in my sleep. I wasn't the fastest, the strongest, or the smartest, but I was relentless. And that relentlessness began to show. It was in field exercises that I first drew notice. We had been assigned a mock mission in the woods, capture the opposing flag and return without being caught. My squad was disorganized, half of them more interested in grumbling than planning. Our leader, a cocky recruit from the city, wanted to rush in head first. I stopped him. I laid out a simple plan. Flank wide, draw attention, send a small unit through the shadows. He laughed at me, said I was just a grunt who didn't know strategy. But when his charge was ambushed and his squad captured, my team slipped through unseen and seized the flag. The instructors were watching. And for the first time I felt the beginnings of respect. Still, respect was fragile. Rank meant nothing at that stage. We were all the same. Nobody's clawing for survival. And outside the drills, life was harsh. The barracks stank of sweat, mildew, and despair. Meals were quick, tasteless, often stolen by the more aggressive recruits. Nights were the worst. Lying awake on thin mattresses, listening to the snoring of strangers, the groans of homesick boys, the distant sound of boots pacing the corridors. In those hours, my mind wandered back to her, to the warmth of family I no longer had. But instead of breaking me, it hardened me. I would whisper into the darkness, "One day you'll see me. One day you'll regret it." Months bled into years. Training turned into deployment. The first time I set foot on foreign soil, rifle in hand, the reality hit me. This was no longer a game. The air was heavy with dust and heat, the horizon alive with danger. Men who had joked in the barracks now went silent, their faces pale beneath their helmets. We were no longer recruits. We were soldiers. Combat was chaos. It was nothing like the clean drills we had rehearsed. The world exploded in noise. Gunfire cracking, mortars shrieking, radios screaming orders we barely heard over the roar. I saw men freeze, men cry, men run. I wanted to run too, but something deeper held me steady. Fear is always there, but discipline keeps you moving. And I moved. I returned fire, I followed orders, I covered my brothers, even when my legs shook beneath me. That night, when the firefight finally ended and silence fell over the shattered village, I sat on the ground, my rifle across my lap, my hands trembling. For the first time, I truly understood what it meant to survive. Survival became my creed. Through mission after mission, I learned the rhythms of war, the sudden violence, the suffocating stillness afterward, the way death came without warning. I lost friends, men who had sweated beside me in training, who had whispered about home under the stars. They were gone in seconds, their lives erased by bullets and bombs. Grief weighed heavy, but I carried it like I carried everything else, as fuel. Every loss drove me harder, pushed me to become the soldier who didn't falter, who others could trust. And slowly the promotions came. First corporal, then sergeant. Each rank was a small step upward, a marker that I was no longer just another recruit. I wasn't trash. I was a leader. Men followed my orders, trusted my judgment, looked to me when chaos raged. And though I wore the uniform with pride, I never forgot the night I first wore it to her wedding, the night she looked at me with disgust. That memory stayed sharp, a wound that refused to close, but also a reminder of how far I had climbed. One evening, years later, after a long mission overseas, I stood alone watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. My uniform was no longer plain. It bore insignias of rank and ribbons of service. My boots were still scuffed, but they carried the weight of miles most men would never walk. I thought of her then, my sister, somewhere far away in her world of wealth and ease. She had cut me out of her life, branded me worthless. But here I was, alive, hardened, respected. Not because she had believed in me, but because I had refused to let her destroy me. I clenched my fists, feeling the calluses on my palms, the strength in my arms, and I made another vow. This was only the beginning. I wasn't done climbing. Not yet. The shift from being a soldier to becoming a leader did not happen overnight. It was not marked by a single medal or a single mission. It was a slow, grinding process, like stone wearing down under the weight of time and storms, only to emerge sharper, more defined. I did not wake up one morning and say to myself, I am a leader now. No, it began in the small moments, in the choices I made when no one was watching, and in the quiet trust my brothers in arms began to place in me. The first true test came during a deployment in the mountains. The terrain was brutal. Sharp ridges, icy winds, and valleys that swallowed sound. We were tasked with securing a high point that controlled the only safe pass through the region. The enemy knew it too, and they were waiting. The firefight that broke out was chaos incarnate. Echoes of gunfire bouncing off stone, dust blinding us, the bitter air cutting through our lungs. Our lieutenant was young, fresh out of school, and when the first burst of fire pinned us down, I saw the fear in his eyes. He froze, clutching his radio as if it could save him. Men looked to him for direction, but none came. I don't know what pushed me forward in that moment. Maybe it was instinct, maybe desperation, or maybe it was that old wound in my chest that refused to let me look weak. I shouted, ordered men to lay suppressive fire, and directed 2 others to flank wide. My voice cut through the noise, louder than the bullets. For a moment, even I was surprised at how they listened, how they moved when I told them to. Within minutes, the tide shifted. We pressed upward, cleared the ridge, and by the time the smoke cleared, we held the high ground. Later, the lieutenant praised me in his report, saying I had shown initiative. But I knew what had really happened. Leadership wasn't about the rank pinned to your chest. It was about being the one willing to act when others froze. That night, around the fire, the men clapped me on the back, their eyes holding something I had never seen before. Trust. And that trust was heavier than any weapon I had ever carried. From that moment the shift was permanent. In every mission after, the men looked to me, not just for orders but for confidence. They wanted to know I believed we could survive, because if I believed, then maybe they could too. That weight was crushing at times. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the stars through the thin fabric of our tents, asking questions no one else heard. What if I fail them? What if I lead them into death? The faces of the fallen haunted me. Friends who had laughed with me one day and were gone the next. Each loss left a scar, invisible but deep, a reminder that leadership was not about glory. It was about carrying ghosts. With time, my responsibilities grew. Sergeant, then staff sergeant, then lieutenant after officer training. Each promotion brought new burdens. I was no longer just responsible for myself, I was responsible for lives, for strategies, for the outcome of missions that could turn the tide of entire campaigns. I studied endlessly, poring over tactics, logistics, history. I learned from older officers, listened more than I spoke, and when I did speak, I made sure my words carried weight. My men didn't need speeches. They needed clarity, honesty, and someone who would bleed beside them. There was one operation that defined this stage of my journey. We were sent to rescue hostages from a fortified compound deep in hostile territory. The odds were grim. The enemy outnumbered us, and the approach was exposed. Some higher officers suggested waiting for reinforcements. But intelligence showed the hostages might not survive another day. I made the call we would go. My men didn't question me. They nodded, checked their gear, and followed. That trust was everything. The night was black as ink when we moved, cutting through the terrain in silence. Every sound, the crunch of gravel, the metallic click of a weapon, felt like thunder. As we closed in, gunfire erupted. The fight was fierce, the kind where every second stretches into eternity. Bullets sparked against walls, shouts echoed in the dark, and I moved through it all like a man possessed. Not because I was fearless, but because I refused to let my fear stop me. I kicked through doors, shouted commands, dragged wounded men out of the line of fire. When we finally broke through and freed the hostages, I saw relief and disbelief in their eyes. We had done what many thought impossible. The mission was hailed as a success, and my name reached ears higher up the chain of command. But what mattered most to me was the look in my men's eyes afterward. They didn't just see me as another officer. They saw me as their shield, their anchor. And that was worth more than any medal they pinned to my chest. Yet with every victory, the old wound throbbed. At night, in the quiet after battle, I would think of her, my sister. Did she ever wonder where I was? Did she ever hear my name in the news, whispered in reports about missions overseas? Did she still think of me as trash? Part of me longed for her to see what I had become, to choke on her own words. But another part of me hardened with every passing year. I realized I no longer needed her approval. Her rejection had shaped me, but it did not define me. What defined me was the loyalty of my men, the respect I earned through blood and fire. Still, I couldn't deny the ache of family lost. On holidays, when others wrote letters home or opened packages from loved ones, I sat empty-handed. No one sent me care packages. No one wrote my name in cheerful handwriting. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. In the loneliness, I leaned even harder on my duty. If I had no family, then my brothers in uniform were my family. If I had no one waiting for me at home, then the battlefield was my home. Years continued their relentless march. My hair grew shorter, my eyes sharper, my body scarred. With each promotion, with each step closer to command, I felt the gap between who I had been and who I had become widen. The boy who had stood humiliated at his sister's wedding was gone. In his place stood a man who carried the weight of lives, who stared down death and did not blink. The day I was pinned as a colonel, standing tall in front of rows of saluting soldiers, I thought of that night again. Her words. Her face twisted in disgust. Flesh. If only she could see me now. The irony was bitter and sweet all at once. I didn't need her acknowledgement anymore. But part of me wanted it, not for validation, but for the satisfaction of showing her how wrong she had been. Leadership had transformed me, but it had also cost me. I bore the invisible scars of responsibility, the memories of men I could not save, the weight of choices that haunted me long after the dust settled. Yet I knew this truth. I had risen. I had climbed out of the pit she had thrown me into and built myself into something greater than either of us could have imagined. And deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because one day, our paths would cross again. And when they did, it would not be me standing in shame at her wedding. It would be her standing in the shadow of everything I had become. The first time I stood on the balcony of the commander's quarters overlooking the oceanfront base, the salt air filled my lungs, and I felt something I had never known before. Permanence. For years my life had been in motion. Training camps, foreign deployments, hostile deserts, cramped barracks. But now, here I was, the colonel in charge of a sprawling coastal installation, a fortress of steel and discipline pressed against the restless sea. From the balcony, I could see the endless stretch of barracks, the airstrip where jets cut through the sky like lightning, the piers where warships rose and fell with the tide. This place was more than concrete and barbed wire. It was a living organism, pulsing with purpose, and I was its heart. Command was different from leading a squad in the field. As a soldier, you fought shoulder to shoulder with men who shared your hunger, your fear, your dirt. As a commander, you became the axis of 1,000 moving parts. Logistics, training schedules, personnel disputes, intelligence reports. Every decision funneled upward until it rested on my desk. Every success was credited to me, and every failure had my name stamped on it. The responsibility was staggering, but I carried it the way I carried everything else, with the steady, stubborn refusal to bend. My men had to see strength always. They had to see certainty, even when the weight of uncertainty pressed against me like a storm tide. The base itself was a marvel. During the day, the horizon filled with a thundering roar of jets taking off, engines shaking the earth beneath my boots. On the piers, sailors worked tirelessly, ropes snapping against the decks, orders barked sharp and precise. Inland, drills filled the air with rhythm, boots pounding pavement, rifles firing in bursts, the cadence of shouted commands rising like a heartbeat. At night, the sea reflected the base's floodlights, casting a glow that seemed to stretch into infinity. Standing there, I often thought of how far I had come, from being the invisible guest at my sister's wedding to the man who commanded an empire of discipline and steel. The men and women under my command respected me, not because of my title, but because of how I had earned it. I walked the grounds daily, never hiding behind an office door. I ate in the same mess halls, listened to their complaints, corrected their mistakes without humiliation. I made sure they knew I had once been where they were. Muddy boots, aching shoulders, doubts gnawing at the edges of sleep. When they saluted me, I knew it wasn't just the silver eagle on my uniform they saluted. It was the years I had bled for. But with command came solitude. The higher you climbed, the lonelier it became. I could not confide in the young soldiers. They needed me untouchable. I could not unburden myself to fellow officers. Competition was too sharp, egos too fragile. Nights stretched long in my quarters, the waves outside crashing endlessly, a reminder of the world beyond the walls. I often poured a glass of scotch, sat at the desk buried in paperwork, and let my thoughts wander to places I had tried to bury. And always she came back to me. My sister. It had been 9 years since I had walked away from her wedding. 9 years of silence, during which she had erased me from her life as thoroughly as if I had never existed. I sometimes wondered if she even remembered I was alive, or if I was nothing more than a ghost she had chosen to forget. In my darkest moments, I imagined her in her world of silk and chandeliers, laughing among people who never had to know what it meant to crawl through mud with a rifle in hand. And though I told myself her opinion no longer mattered, some part of me burned for her to see me now, to see the man she had discarded, standing unbroken at the helm of power. That chance came sooner than I expected. It was an ordinary afternoon. I had just returned from inspecting the southern docks, where a new shipment of supplies had arrived. My boots were still wet with salt water when my aide stepped into my office. His expression tight. "Sir, there's someone requesting to see you," he said. "Handle it," I replied without looking up. Requests for my time were constant. Contractors, local officials, even the occasional journalist. My aide hesitated. "Sir, it's personal. She says she's your sister." The words froze me. For a moment I thought I had misheard. I lifted my head slowly, the pen stilling in my hand. "My sister." "Yes, sir." She arrived at the gate in a private car. "She's waiting at the visitor center under escort." I leaned back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. 9 years. 9 years of silence, of nothing. And suddenly she appeared at my gates as if the years between us had not existed. 1,000 questions rushed through me. Why now? What did she want? And above all, why did I feel the old wound in my chest tear open again? "Bring her in," I said finally, my voice steady though my hands trembled slightly against the desk. Minutes later the door opened and she stepped inside. She was as beautiful as ever, but different. Her face carried lines of worry, her eyes were restless, darting around the room before finally settling on me. She wore a tailored dress, diamonds glinting at her wrists, but the confidence she once radiated was gone. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as though life had finally dealt her the blows she had been spared in youth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavier than any battlefield I had ever stood on. Finally she whispered, "You've changed." I stood, my uniform crisp, the insignia of colonel gleaming on my chest. "So have you," I said. Her eyes filled with something I had never seen in her before. Fear. She clasped her hands tightly, her voice trembling as she said, "I need your help." Those words struck me harder than her insult years ago. Help. From me. The brother she had once called trash. The irony was sharp enough to cut through steel. I could feel the weight of the years between us pressing down, all the anger, the loneliness, the scars she had left on me. And now she stood in front of me, humbled, desperate. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked past her to the window, staring out at the endless horizon. Jets roared overhead, soldiers marched below, the sea crashed against the rocks. This was my kingdom, my fortress, my proof that I had risen above everything she had once believed I was. And now the past had walked through my door, demanding to be reckoned with. I turned back to her, my expression unreadable. "Sit down," I said quietly. She obeyed. And as I took my seat across from her, I knew this was no longer about family. This was about power. About who we had become after all the years apart. And for the first time I realized the tables had turned. She sat across from me, her eyes shimmering with a nervousness that I had never seen in her before, and as I studied her, I could not help but recall the girl she once was. Radiant, untouchable, quick with laughter and quicker still with judgment, the sister who had crowned herself the pride of the family and cast me as its shame. For years I had lived with the sting of her words, those careless daggers at her wedding that had cut me deeper than bullets ever had. And now, here she was, older, humbled, and carrying some invisible weight that bent her proud shoulders. She clasped her hands together, fingers trembling, and said again in a voice heavy with desperation, "I need your help." The words echoed in the vast silence of my office, louder than the roar of jets outside, louder than the crash of waves that never ceased against the rocks. For a long time I simply stared at her, letting her discomfort grow, savoring the shift in power that had tilted the world upside down. Because once I had been the one small and unseen, begging for acknowledgement, and she the queen on her throne, careless with cruelty. Now, in this fortress I commanded, I was the immovable mountain, and she the one who had come crawling. "Why?" I asked at last, my voice quiet but sharp as steel. Her eyes darted to the floor as she struggled for words, and then she told me a story that unfolded like a rotten fruit splitting open. Her husband, the man she had married on that fateful day when she cast me aside before the entire family, had built an empire of wealth and glamour on lies. He had taken her through mansions, through ballrooms, through glittering circles of influence where she played the perfect wife, but behind the silk curtains and champagne glasses, he had gambled away fortunes, borrowed from men whose smiles hid knives, and entangled himself in debts that no bank and no law could untangle. When the house of cards collapsed, it collapsed on her head too, leaving her name dragged through mud, her assets frozen, her reputation in ashes. The creditors were not the kind who filed paperwork and waited for courts. These were men who broke legs, who made people disappear, who reminded debtors of their promises with blood on the pavement. "They're after me," she whispered, tears clinging to her lashes. "They've already come to the house." I barely got away. I didn't know where else to turn. Her voice cracked, and for the first time in my life, I saw my sister broken. Not the flawless goddess of family dinners and weddings, but a frightened woman stripped of armor. A strange mix of emotions surged through me. Part of me wanted to laugh at the irony, to remind her of the night she called me an embarrassment, to tell her that this was the price of her arrogance. Another part of me, the soldier who had dragged bleeding comrades from fire, the man who had buried too many friends, felt the old instinct to protect, to shield even those who had wounded me. I stood slowly and walked to the window, watching the sea churn restlessly below. "Why me?" I asked without turning. You made it clear once I wasn't good enough to even sit at your table. Why not your rich friends? Why not the family you chose over me? There was a pause, heavy and sharp, and then she answered in a voice that sounded small, almost childlike. Because they're gone. When the money vanished, so did they. And the family. They said I deserved this, that it was my fault for living blind. You're the only one I have left. I closed my eyes, the words digging into me, reopening scars I thought had healed. For years I had imagined this moment, imagined her crawling back and begging for forgiveness, and in those fantasies I always turned away, left her to drown as she once left me. Yet now, faced with her fragile frame trembling across from me, reality was more complicated than vengeance. I turned back and looked at her, truly looked, and I saw the cost of her choices etched into her face. She was no longer the sister who mocked me in front of chandeliers and cameras. She was human, flawed, afraid. Slowly, I moved to my desk and sat, folding my hands before me. What exactly do you want from me? Asked. Her eyes lit up with desperate hope. Protection, she said quickly. Just until it's safe. I know you have resources, soldiers, power. They wouldn't dare touch me if I were under your wing. Please, just until this nightmare ends. Her plea filled the room, but I said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until her shoulders sagged. Finally I leaned forward. Do you know what you're asking? Do you realize what it means to involve the military in your personal mess? Do you think this is a hotel where you can hide behind uniforms? I built this with blood and discipline, not to babysit the people who once threw me aside. My voice was sharp, harder than I intended, but it was the truth. She flinched, tears threatening to spill, and whispered, I know I don't deserve it. I know what I did to you. But you're the only one I can trust now. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with years of silence and bitterness. Finally, I stood and walked around the desk, stopping before her. I could see my reflection in her eyes. My uniform, my scars, the man she had once dismissed but who now towered above her fate. Gently, I placed a hand on her shoulder, and her tears finally fell. You were right that night, I said quietly. I wasn't the polished, perfect son. I wasn't the family's pride. I was the embarrassment. But look at me now. Look at what your embarrassment became. She sobbed softly, nodding, unable to lift her head. For a moment, I let her cry, let the years of arrogance and cruelty drain from her in tears. Then I stepped back. I'll help you, I said at last, and she gasped, lifting her eyes to mine with a flicker of gratitude. But before relief could fully bloom, I added, not because you deserve it, not because you asked, but because I am not the man you thought I was. I don't abandon family, even when they abandon me. That's the difference between us. Arrangements were made quickly. A secure residence within the base was prepared, guarded by men loyal to me. My sister was shielded from the predators hunting her, and for the first time in years, she slept without fear. Yet between us, the silence remained heavy. She would glance at me sometimes as though searching for words of apology, but none ever came, and I did not ask for them. Had no need. My life, my command, my soldiers, those were my vindication. She could live the rest of her days knowing that the brother she once shamed had saved her when no one else would, and that truth was heavier than any revenge I could have spoken. Weeks later, when the threats against her finally waned, when the men chasing debts found themselves silenced by forces I quietly maneuvered, my sister came to me once more. She stood in my office doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and awe. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. I looked up from my desk, the ocean wind rattling the windows behind me, and gave her the smallest of smiles. You don't need to, I replied. Living with the memory of who you called me, and who I am now, is thanks enough. She lowered her gaze, tears falling once more, but I had already returned to my papers. The waves outside crashed endlessly, as they always had, as they always would, and I felt a strange peace settle over me. The boy she once humiliated was gone. The man she had turned to in desperation was all that remained. I had risen, I had endured, and in the end, it was not vengeance that defined me, but strength. and as she left my office for the last time, I knew the story was over. Not with revenge, not with hatred, but with victory. Backhand index pointing right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more powerful twists and unforgettable stories.